Revision Commission of 2018. Let's begin, as is our custom, by asking folks to introduce themselves. We will start with Mr. Bragg.
Good morning, I'm Kyle Bragg, I'm Secretary Treasurer, SCIU 32BJ. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Larry D'Angelo. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for State and Local Governance.
Good morning, I'm Sharon Greenberger. I'm the president of the YMCA of Greater New York.
Good morning, Carlos Chasura, President CEO of the New York Building Congress.
I'm Cesar Morales, and I'm the former Secretary of State of New York, and I previously had served as Deputy Mayor of New York City.
Good morning, my name is Dale Ho. I am a lawyer at the American Civil Liberties Union.
Good morning, John Siegel. I'm a lawyer, private practice, a partner in the Baker Hostetler law firm.
That's Matt Gawab on the end, who is not a member of the commission, so he doesn't get to introduce himself. The purpose of today's hearing is to discuss our preliminary report. As some of you, and some of you look familiar, know that we've had an extensive series of public hearings. We've gotten hundreds of comments. We've had actual hearings with experts on particular subjects, and all of that has been distilled, I think, quite well by the staff in the report that is being published today. Matt, to the folks in the audience, have they seen the report? Or?
The report is available now on our website.
It's available on the website. I've got one with actual pictures, so I have an advantage. Basically, where we were is that at our May 31st hearing, we asked the staff to write a preliminary report based on the public comment and the public testimony. And that's what we have before us today. I want to thank the staff for what I think is an excellent job. And I think at this point, I think it'd be useful if Matt were to provide us with the highlights of the report. With that, I give you Matt Gawab.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, and let me echo your thanks to the terrific staff that we have. A lot of hours and great work into this report. So we appreciate that very much. I'm gonna go through the preliminary staff report now and hit some of the highlights for all of you. Let me just say, as a preliminary matter, that we've carefully reviewed each and every comment submitted to the commission. We've examined the entire charter, and through this report, we seek to achieve three goals. The first is to summarize the hundreds of comments we've received from New Yorkers across the 5 boroughs, as well as from advocates, elected officials, academics, and other experts. The second is to recommend specific proposals for consideration, further consideration by the Commission in the 5 issue areas the Commission has resolved to focus on. And third, to inform the public about the issues the Commission is considering and to help the Commission formulate ballot questions for the public's consideration in November. This report is intended to be a living document. It will not limit the Commission's consideration of other issues, nor its recommendations set in stone. Indeed, we're now going to be beginning next week another tour of the 5 boroughs to hear from members of the public in response to this report. And of course, we expect the report to change and to evolve in response to public comment. Next slide. Here are the major focus areas. I'm going to briefly summarize the report. The focus areas are campaign finance, municipal elections in New York City, civic engagement, community boards, and the districting process. For each of these, I'm going to discuss the findings of the report, and then after I finish with this presentation, we're going to, we'll hand it back to you, Mr. Chair, to facilitate a discussion on these points. On campaign finance, the Commission received numerous campaign finance reform proposals, mostly addressing contribution limits, the public matching formula, and the matching funds cap. Staff recommends in this area that the Commission strongly consider proposing an amendment reducing contribution limits, strengthening the public match, and increasing the cap on public matching funds. The Commission should carefully consider when any proposed amendments go into effect, how each proposed change to the system will interact with other proposed changes, how these changes will affect the ability of participating and non-participating candidates to run competitive campaigns, and how the changes will impact the cost of the program. All of these are laid out these issues are described in some detail in the preliminary staff report, as you can imagine. Municipal elections in New York City. The Commission received a large number of proposals on how to improve elections in the city and increase voter participation. The proposals fell into three general categories. Proposals for modernizing the administration of elections, such as changes to voter registration processes and proposals to adopt early voting. 2, proposals for increased access to voting, either through direct changes to voter eligibility requirements, such as lowering the voting age or non-citizen voting, or by removing practical barriers by offering things such as increased language assistance. 3, proposals to address a lack of engagement among voters. The most common proposal along these lines was ranked choice voting, a system intended to better capture voter preferences. Staff recommends in this portion of the report that the Commission continue to study a range of proposals to increase voter participation. In particular, we recommend that the Commission continue to study election modernization proposals, but solicit further input on which reforms might be best achieved at the state level. Focus on proposals that address elements of election systems specific to New York City, such as possible ranked choice voting in local primaries. Respond to identified needs of New Yorkers, such as strengthening and expanding language assistance services. And finally, the staff recommends that the Commission consider reforms that promote civic engagement as a means of increasing voter participation. Speaking of civic engagement, next slide, in our next subject matter area. As you recall from our public hearings, many commenters voiced a concern about the health of the city's democracy and offered proposals meant to promote civic engagement. The themes and proposals most frequently presented to the Commission include creating an agency to coordinate and enhance the city's current efforts, all of which are described in some detail in the preliminary staff report. Promote civic engagement as a continuum of opportunities for regularly participating in the civic life of the city. Promote engagement that is local, community-based, and culturally relevant, and better inform the public about opportunities for engagement. So on next steps here, we recommend further study of ways to strengthen the city's efforts to engage its residents, including through the possible establishment of a new entity or office. And what we laid out in this slide is the questions that we think we ought to hear from the public on in order to better formulate a proposal for a potential new office or entity. Our next broad subject matter area is community boards. Members of the public, experts, and elected officials expressed a strong interest in making the city's 59 community boards more reflective of the communities that they represent. Many of the comments we received on community boards indicated that some boards may be insufficiently diverse, both demographically and ideologically, lack a consistent and centralized appointment process, and do not have adequate resources, particularly in urban planning, but also in other areas. In response to these concerns, we recommend that the Commission consider 4 proposals we've listed above: consideration of proposals to impose term limits for community board members, a standardization and enhancement of the existing appointment process, additional support and resources to community boards, particularly in the context of urban planning, but potentially in other areas as well, and proposals to adopt other methods to ensure that community boards are representative of the communities that they serve. Finally, the districting process. A little bit of background. After every decennial census, the mayor and the city council appoint a 15-member districting commission to draw city council district lines to accommodate changes in population. The next districting plan will take effect in 2023. The commission heard a variety of proposals relating to the process by which district lines are drawn. Some commenters expressed concern that the recent districting cycle did not give due consideration to the voting power of racial and ethnic minority groups. Others emphasized the importance of the independence of the districting commission and suggested changes to the appointment process. Finally, commenters expressed concern about the integrity of the upcoming 2020 census, in particular relating to potential undercounts in New York City. As next steps in this area, we recommend further study of procedures to address the effects of the districting process on racial and ethnic minority groups. This might include providing for an additional review of proposed lines by an independent expert. The further study of alternations to the structure of the districting commission to promote its independence and reduce the influence of elected officials, including possible changes to the appointment process. We've seen models of this and heard about them from various witnesses before the commission from other jurisdictions. And finally, further study strategies to counteract the negative effects of an undercount in the next census on the districting process. That is a very fast overview of a 100+ page report, but at a high level, that's what's there. Then, Mr. Chair, before I turn it back over to you for the discussion, just a couple of notes on calendar and next steps for the commissioners to be aware of. So as I think people know, and as reflected on this slide, we're about to enter Charter Week next week. This is very exciting. We have hearings coming up in Manhattan on July 23rd, Bronx on July 24th, Queens on the 25th, Brooklyn on the 26th, and then finally Staten Island, where we began this process on the 31st. And we'll, of course, all the details have been made public through press advisories on the website, et cetera. We'll continue to advertise those events. Of course, we're continuing the Commission's robust outreach efforts through Commissioner in Your Borough events, which are somewhat informal community-based events to engage the public on a neighborhood level, community meetings and grassroots events, continued meetings with subject matter experts, and of course continuing to take written comments from the public by mail, email, through our website, and on social media. The members of the public that are here, of course, hope that you will continue to engage with us through whatever means is most convenient. And looking ahead, August, we will hold public meetings to discuss and to vote on a final report and any ballot proposals. September 7th, the ballot proposals, if any, are due to be filed with the city clerk. That is our deadline. September, then, launching a public education campaign, which we'll talk about more in future meetings. And then, of course, November 6th is Election Day, when the public will weigh in on any ballot proposals that we propose. So with that, I will hand it back to the chair to facilitate a discussion on each of these areas. And of course, we thank the commissioners for the opportunity to do this work. We're very appreciative on behalf of all the staff, so thanks very much.
Thank you, Matt. It goes without saying, this is a meeting of the members of the commission. We will not entertain comments from the public. But let me begin by thanking the commission members. I think just about everybody who's here today has either spoken to me person to person or has had a lengthy conversation with me, so that their views have certainly been incorporated in the narrowing of the issues that the staff has conducted. So my thanks to the other members of the commission for taking the time to engage with me on many of these issues. With that, what I want to do, sort of highlight, and it may sound a little repetitive, but I'll do it in a matter of seconds, each of the 5 issue areas. And ask folks to comment. I know you've commented to me personally, but it's been done individually. And so it may be useful to comment and have the other commission members hear your thoughts on particular issues. Let's start with one that may be the most difficult or maybe the easiest. I don't know which. It's campaign finance reform. I think the staff has asked us to consider lowering the contribution limits, increasing matching funds, even increasing the cap for matching funds. So we are very engaged in this process now. We've asked the consultants to do some modeling for us to see what happens if you lower the contribution limits or you increase the match. And we want to be sure that both participating and non-participating candidates can run competitive campaigns. With that as an opening statement, are any of the members of the commission want to comment publicly on where we are?
I can begin if you
Good.
want. I would begin by saying the round of hearings that's been conducted throughout the city have been extremely informative for me, and I dare to say for the rest of the commission. The challenges that exist in our electoral system about leveling the playing field to allow a more open process and allow people to participate in the electoral process in the city in a means and a fashion that is fair and equitable to all. And trying to continue to remove the barriers that exist to keep everyday activists and normal people who are engaged on our political system the ability to run equally and fairly in the contest for political office. And so without having any particular determination about what is the right course to pursue, I think the information that's been provided to us and the information I'm sure that we'll continue to get as we continue our hearings will allow us to formulate a recommendation and that we can present to the citizens of New York to make a more fair and equitable process for finance campaign.
Yeah, I want to thank you for saying that, because I almost took it for granted that everybody understood that what we are hoping to do is to the extent possible, level the playing field. Let people who have less of an ability to raise big money to run for office, and to run for office successfully. And so in order to do that, we're looking for ways of decreasing big contributions, looking at ways of coming up with a more generous match, so that if you get a small contribution, it'll be multiplied and mean that much more. So these are the things that we're looking at. We have not come down on the exact dollar amounts, but that is what we hope to do as we finalize our discussions. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of things. First of all, the staff did a great job in putting together the draft report, so congrats. You know, we are living in a very flush economy, God bless you. Everything's going great, we have a lot of money, surpluses, etc. Obviously, that is not going to be the case forever. So I want us to all be mindful that if we are increasing matching, there are more people than ever running for office, which is wonderful. But let's be careful of the city budget, because I would not want to be the person, and I don't think any of us would want to be the commission that added holes in budgets, you know, long-term down the road. Even if it's small, it's still something. So I want us to think about that. I think it'd be great, and I hate to give you and your team, Matt, more work, to present some, you know, different ideas. So if you went from 175 to 250 and went 8 to 1 and lowered it from, for the mayor, 5,100 to 3,800, whatever it is. Maybe give us some different recommendations. I think that would be great. And then the other thing I would say is, if we're going to do changes on contribution limits, it should be a percentage that is going to affect every level. So we shouldn't arbitrarily say for the mayor it's this, for the council it's this, for the borough president it's this, for comptroller, public advocate. My opinion would be we're going to say it's 20%, or whatever the number is, but it should be fair across the board. Because I think then it gives a very clear message that we are looking at every office equally. So those would be my recommendations.
Dale?
I'd just like to say a few words. First, I just want to thank the staff for putting together this report under, I think, very, under a lot of time pressure. Even with the narrow focus, I shouldn't say narrow, but even with the circumscribed focus of the issues that we've been talking about, you could talk about almost an infinite number of things under the charter, but we've focused on a few things, and even within that range of things, there's so much to do and think about, and I think the staff has done a tremendous job of distilling the input that we've gotten in hearings and charting a recommended course forward, so I just want to thank you for that. I was struck, with respect to campaign finance, by the fact that even though the New York City campaign finance system is frequently described as a model for the rest of the country, and I think rightfully so, it's a good system that is functioning well. Even with that good system, I was struck by the amount of testimony that we received from people saying that there isn't adequate access to the system for candidates of different means, that there's still a feeling that the system isn't fair, that there is at least an appearance of corruption, even if people aren't identifying sort of specific corrupt incidents in New York City politics in recent years. There's an appearance that pay to play is still a thing that happens in our politics, and that there's room for improvement even in this model campaign finance system that we have. It would be great, I think, if we had more time to consider some of the more radical proposals that have been talked about around the country. Given our time constraints, I think it's appropriate to think about, to focus our thoughts, not exclusively, if in upcoming hearings, if there's views that people want to express about making more radical transformations of the system, but I think it's appropriate, given the amount of time that we have, to focus on the areas that have been talked about today, specific to the contribution limits, the amount of matching funds, and then the cap on matching funds. I think there's always room for improvement in those areas to help improve the appearance of our elections. Thank you.
John?
So in the area of campaign finance, where I've litigated and represented campaigns extensively, I've been very impressed by the detail and sophistication of the discussion, not just the staff presentation, which we expect because the staff largely on loan from the law departments at a very high level, but also the discussion among commissioners, and particularly the presentations of advocates, where I think the discussion as you've laid it out and the decision tree that we have is really shows a very sophisticated understanding among the participants in this debate. I do think that we have to be mindful of the larger environment that we are dealing with, and not just be in a New York City bubble, given the changes that have happened just this month or happening now in the Supreme Court of the United States, that anything we do in this area is regulating on a on a difficult and changing playing field, and that while we can among ourselves get into a debate about proposals, all of which really are quite significant, if not radical. I mean, talking about cutting the contribution limit by 50% is a very, very, very significant step that has a 50% impact on the First Amendment rights of New Yorkers who participate in politics, and can only be justified by a really compelling anti-corruption rationale. And so we've got to remain mindful of that, because I don't think anyone here wants to go into the 2021 election cycle with campaign finance changes that are in litigation, subject to uncertainty. We need to make sure we get this right on a legal basis, and I think it would be helpful to hear more from the staff about just what room we have to regulate on contribution limits, expenditure limits, et cetera, so that we make sure we get it right.
Let me just make one point before I ask Sharon to make her point. There's been a lot of discussion about the appearance of corruption. And both you and Dale have raised it. That is of utmost concern to all of us as we examine this question. But we're also aware of the fact that we've got some Supreme Court decisions that would ask us to balance what the Supreme Court has found to be an expression of freedom of expression, being engaged and being involved in the contribution. So those two things are uppermost in our minds. We're concerned about the appearance of corruption, but we don't want to limit anybody's freedom of expression as the Supreme Court has described it. Sharon?
Yes, thank you. I just also want to thank the staff for putting together such a comprehensive report. This has been a real education for me, which relates to my point around sequencing. So as we think about these things, and I know it's not something we're going to decide today, but I think as we look at each of these areas and we think about what are the implications for rollout and what are our recommendations on sequencing that rollout, whether it's for the next election or a midterm piece, it's something that we should, I think, look at for each one of these just to make sure that we're not inconsistent, or where there is inconsistencies to understand the rationale for doing so.
With that, this took a little longer than I thought it would. But we have obviously great interest in campaign finance reform. The second major issue is described as municipal elections in New York City. I think of it as increasing voter participation, but it's basically the same thing. And that there were two recommendations that staff asked us to look at. One was the question of ranked choice voting or instant runoffs, and the other was improving voter assistance services. And we heard testimony about the need for better language assistance. Any thoughts from the commission members on these two?
I mean, I would just add that I've been very intrigued consistently by instant runoff elections. And I would say that, Matt, that would be something we've heard at many hearings. I know we've talked about that maybe we should spend a little extra time on as we move forward.
I was just going to, I am also equally intrigued. I know you had mentioned, Matt, that it's intriguing in part because it captures voter preferences. One of the reasons I am particularly intrigued by it is because it seems to be an added efficiency. If we can reduce an additional election or turnout, I think that would be something very worthy.
Yeah.
I know that we received a lot of testimony about various election administration issues around, say, voter registration, and also testimony about voter qualifications such as age and citizenship. I know that those are not being highlighted as areas that we are going to focus on or recommended to focus on necessarily, going forward, I think my understanding anyway is due in part to legal limitations on the authority of the city to act in those areas absent revisions to either the state constitution or state statutes. And I understand those concerns. I would still, I think, be interested in hearing testimony on those issues to the extent that this commission can stake out a position on various issues within our legal authority, or even make recommendations that might go to future state statutory changes. So that's one thing. And then I guess I would also say that there are items like the voter registration deadline that I know are prescribed by the state constitution, but to the extent that there's any play in the joints to, for purposes of municipal elections, make some changes in that area, it's something that I would be interested in hearing a little bit more about.
Kyle Bragg. So I failed to recognize and thank the incredible staff that has been doing this work through this process of this commission, and not only managing the work of the commission, but helping to manage the volunteer commissioners and do the best they could to allow for our participation and availability through this process. And I think most of the points that I wanted to make have been made already in Dale, but I would only add that we've heard testimony too. I'm not quite sure how responsive we can be through the commission on issues like language access during municipal elections. And so I found that a very compelling issue, and if there's ways that we can address that, I thought that is something that we would like our staff professionals to guide us on, as well as voting access. And so I think those were there were very compelling testimonies and presentations given to the commission. I expect that we will hear more in the coming hearings as we do the second round of tours around the boroughs. And again, rely heavily on our staff professionals to guide us through those deliberations. Thank you.
You know, I'm ready to move on, but I too want to indicate that this is going to be a tough one. This is, as Dale points out, we have to see how far we can go, given that so much of election administration is controlled by state statute, state constitution, and what it is that we might be able to do in that area. We're going to heavily rely on our lawyers to tell us where we can go. And with that, I think we also need to continue to discuss ranked choice voting. It's a very complicated issue, and I can tell you, just as you may have felt that there is not unanimity on the part of this commission on some of these issues, that is one in which there is clearly no unanimity. Larian?
Thank you. Ranked choice voting is intriguing, and it is interesting, and it does, in fact, end up giving you one less runoff than you might otherwise have had. But I think that, you know, we always need to be mindful of unintended consequences, particularly in something very new and very different. And I was struck by the political science professor from Hofstra, whose initial statement on ranked choice voting is, what problem are you looking to solve? And while I agree, especially as a budget person, that the second runoff always costs money, there are some things you just probably are better off paying for. So I would like to see a little bit more data on the benefits of ranked choice voting and some notion of what the unintended consequences might be. And you're right, we're not unanimous.
Yeah, well, you've made the point clearly. With that, I think we should move on. And again, we're going to engage in a discussion of an issue that, again, we do not have what I would call unanimity of opinion. It's got to do with how we would strengthen the city's efforts to engage its residents in setting policy, in engaging in our democracy in a more active way. Much of the testimony seemed to suggest that the city ought to create a new office, an office of civic engagement. Even though we also heard that there was a great deal of activity on the part of the city of New York. We've got an office of the disabled that testified. We know a very strong office that deals with immigrant affairs, a voter assistance operation, strong volunteer office, so that it's a little bit complicated as to whether or not you put all of that under one office, whether or not you better coordinate it, and for that reason I think staff is recommended that we study ways to do this. Any of the commission members want to weigh in on this point, just give us an overall sense of where they think we ought to be going?
So I just a quick comment. I'm a fan of less bureaucracy. So I think creating an additional office would not be something I would enjoy seeing. I mean, I hate to give you more work, but aren't you guys already doing civic engagement? And I think the chair, your comments are right on point. There's a lot of different offices. Maybe it's our job to help coordinate them better, but to just add another office would not be on my top 10.
Yeah, well, first I should start off by thanking the staff for their great work. I mean, just to, I guess, echo what both Carlo and the chair have said, I mean, I think everyone on the commission is in favor of increased civic engagement, but concerned as to how it would be implemented, where the office would sit. I think those are issues that we would need to drill down on. And obviously, the concern of increased bureaucracy is something that we would have to discuss. I mean, we want to make sure whatever we do is...
While you have the microphone, introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, my name is Marco Carrion. I'm currently Commissioner of Community Affairs for the City of New York.
John Siegel. So I've listened to this discussion on civic engagement. It's very interesting. I'm several decades away from having worked in city government, and the issue of what office is situated where in the bureaucracy is a theoretical concern, but not something I have a direct view on or interest in at this point. As I've listened, the one very tangible, meaningful, specific thing I've heard is the discussion of participatory budgeting, which to me is the one thing we've heard that is not only new and different, but really promises to engage communities and citizens in meaningful government decision-making that will affect their communities and their lives in a very specific way. And I'd like, if in the next month as we're discussing this, if we could see proposals that speak directly to sort of the implementation of that, proposed mandating of it on a citywide basis, where the funds would come from, how much funds, how they would be administered, how communities and citizens would be organized to do that. One way, of course, is to create an office and leave it to that office to figure out over time, but I think it makes sense for us to look very specifically at the implementation of that and consider whether it makes sense.
I would agree with that. As someone who has had the benefit of participating in participatory budget in my district, it is important because it offers two things, education and responsibility, which is really at the root of what we're trying to get at when we talk about civic engagement. And part of the reason I think it has been successful is because it's been a grassroots effort. And so I agree with Carlo on figuring out where we can leverage our existing resources and our existing practices before we think about establishing additional bureaucratic measures. I think that that's an important thing to consider.
Kyle?
So I agree with both my fellow commissioners on those points. I would only add that the thing that most excited me about that discussion was how do we build or continue to build youth engagement? The participatory budgeting process, which allowed for young adults and teenagers to be engaged, I think it was very appropriately put here. Early engagement helps to develop the muscle of civic engagement. I think that was really appropriately worded, that we have to be very deliberate about how we engage our youth so that we can build our civic muscle and get the next generation engaged in civic society. And so hearing a lot of testimony about that, I'm very excited with the possibilities that we can come at and figure out how we build that muscle, how we get youth more engaged in the process and politics and civic engagement in the city. So I concur with my fellow commissioners on that point.
Very good. In fairness, because we do have a few missing commissioners, even though let me note for the record that we do have a quorum. There are some folks that liked the idea of creating a new entity so that we are clearly need to continue to engage on this issue and come to this conclusion, but I do agree that just about everybody liked the concept of expanding participatory budgeting. That was pretty clear in my conversations with all of my commission members. Moving on, and it sort of flows through this because we kept some folks alluded to how we would do something like that. We're going to talk about community boards, which might be a vehicle for managing some of this increased civic engagement. 4 particular staff recommendations: term limits, the appointments process, providing additional resources, particularly in regards to urban planning, and the last is ensuring that the community boards are representative of the communities that they serve. Any reaction to these 4 recommendations by staff?
I guess I'll start off. I got to say, I was actually very surprised by the amount of testimony we heard regarding community boards, which showed, even though most of the testimony had been critical, I mean, the fact that folks came to testify in front of the commission meant that they considered community boards to be important to the democracy of the city. And I think that what the staff laid out is a very good starting point as we look to, I guess, speak to those criticisms and the concerns that we heard regarding community boards, both in their representation, to make them more democratic, to empower community boards, to increase their responsibility. And I think that this is definitely something that I'd be interested, and I'm going to be interested in discussing further.
So this is something that is very near and dear to my heart. And I think I mentioned that I oversaw the community board process for 5 years in Brooklyn. I love each of these 4, and I really hope that we can together come to an understanding that this can really reshape how communities look and make them look exactly how people live there and are there, and I think that's amazing. I would just add one thing on number 2. I would also have some sort of standardized process for hiring the district managers across the city, because each community board kind of does it in a different way. But if we're going to standardize picking members, let's have some sort of procedure or something on the district managers as well.
Can I just add something to that around the standardization, which I am interested and in favor of, but I think you always have to think about, if you have standardization, where's the accountability for it? And where does that sit? And what does that look like? And if it's increased transparency, how are we measuring that? And I think it's something that we could look at a little bit more in the coming weeks.
And I think, one thing that would confuse boards is many of them don't understand their relationship, and I'm talking about the district manager and staff, their relationship to CAU, and then their relationship to the borough presidents. And if we can clarify exactly that, who reports to whom, what the lines are they straight lines, are they dotted lines? Some borough presidents wind up doing HR for community boards, some don't. It's a very confusing thing, so it'd be great to have a conversation about that.
I'm pleased. Seems to be much more unanimity of opinion on when it comes to community boards, and I think the idea is that we've got to find a way to perhaps get some stuff on our ballot that's going to make a difference about how community boards work and how community boards can be used to increase the democracy in our city. And so I'm glad we've got some consensus on community boards. The last issue that we need to think about is one that not all of us thought would be of such interest. Just as Marcos was surprised by the interest in community boards by the public, I was surprised by the concern about redistricting and the fact that one of the largest growing communities in our city, the Asian community, both including the South Asian community, don't think that the lines were fairly drawn. And this raised the whole issue of the fact that there would no longer be Department of Justice oversight over the drawing of lines by the City Council, which in essence they have the majority of the board that does the actual drawing of lines. Does anybody have any thoughts, comments? Dale?
I too was struck by the number of comments we got about redistricting, and in particular the concerns of members of the Asian American community that to the effect that they felt that their voting power as a community had been diluted in the last redistricting cycle, and that there were perhaps inadequate safeguards in place. The demise of the federal preclearance regime under the Voting Rights Act is obviously a problem around the country, although I will note that it existed in 2010, and notwithstanding the existence of federal preclearance at that time, we still got a redistricting plan which produced results that led to at least some level of dissatisfaction from some of the witnesses that we heard. I haven't studied the redistricting plan closely enough in detail to speak, I think, intelligently about whether or not in fact it is problematic, but given the concerns that we did hear, I am interested in hearing a little bit more in terms of concrete proposals that might make our redistricting process one that is more inclusive and also is more likely to produce results that, notwithstanding the diversity that we have, the great diversity that we have in the City Council, can do better in terms of reflecting the diversity of the city as a whole. And to that extent, I would invite members of the community who might participate in future public hearings, to the extent that they have ideas in this regard, to propose specific measures, So not simply to articulate concerns, but to speak about proposals that could address those concerns and to make sure there's a match between those things that might potentially give more voters of color an opportunity to elect their preferred candidates. And one path that I might suggest would be the state voting rights acts that have been passed in California and in Washington state that might serve as a model or a set of ideas for how we might do a better job in that area. Now, those two state voting rights acts were limited specifically to contexts where local elections are conducted at large. But there was an amendment to the California one in 2014 by the man who's now the Secretary of State of California, Alex Padilla, that would extend the protections of the California Voting Rights Act to cities that currently have district-based elections. And I would be interested, I'm not advocating that at this time, but I would be interested in hearing proposals in that regard.
I would add, one of the things that's been bandied about for years, and something that has always interested me, and I know we heard some testimony about it, is the idea of coterminous community boards with council districts. It would obviously mean increasing the council by probably 6 or 7 individuals, but you do have community boards and police precincts coterminous. And there have been articles about, I guess it was in the 60s, that there was a push to do coterminality across the city. Worth looking at as we look at community boards and districting process, because there might be some connection. Again, I'm not advocating either way, but I think it's a worthwhile investment of time.
Yeah, and there's also the problem of the health districts, the fire districts, and it does make it very hard for anyone on the community boards to kind of wrap their mind around, it's like my fire district, my health district, it becomes very difficult. So if there's any way to make everything coterminous, that would probably be good.
I would just add that it's a very important issue for our city. I don't think politicians or government should be deliberately marginalizing the voice of any community. And so whatever that answer is, I think we should dig deep enough to unpack it so that we can figure out the best route to allowing all communities to have an equal voice in government.
Sharon?
Yes, I would only add to Dale's point around sort of asking for more specificity, this question of ensuring independence on that redistricting group is one that's intriguing, but I don't fully understand it. And so really understanding what are the alternatives that would generate increased independence, what do we mean by that, and what does that look like, I think needs a little work.
Yeah, I think we've all been intrigued, I think that's the word that some of you folks are using, at the idea of improving the redistricting process, but we need to see what alternatives are available to us that will make sense in New York City. And so I agree with having this as one of the issues that we focus on over the next several weeks. But I think what I've heard is that there is not unanimity of opinion on many of these issues. I've got in the back of my head a clock that is ticking. I know that there's an election soon, and so I think we're going to have to really focus, take advantage of every minute, and try to get to consensus on at least some of these issues so that we can agree to put something on the ballot that will improve democracy in our city. I assume we're all in agreement? Matt, any last minute thoughts? No? Well, then I will entertain, oh, you've got a last minute thought.
I just wanted to mention that Recently, we had the opportunity to hear from our New York City veterans. It was an amazing discussion that took place at the Fire Museum, and a lot of, I think, poignant ideas and suggestions came out of that discussion, and hope to further that and share, the outcome of that meeting with the other commissioners who were unable to attend.
Great, thank you. Which just leaves one thought before I turn to you, Dale, is that we've done enormous outreach. I'm very proud of the fact that this commission has probably held more hearings, met with more people, and entertained more comments than any other prior charter revision commission. Dale?
I just wanted to add one comment, and that is just an expression of gratitude to members of the community who've testified at all of our hearings, including to people who've testified on issues that don't fall into the 5 major buckets of issues that we have talked about and focused on today. Those comments are appreciated. The concerns that people have raised about other issues that could be addressed potentially through the city charter or otherwise, we take seriously. I know I take them seriously. I think I speak for everyone on the commission that we take those seriously. The fact that we have a limited amount of time and a limited focus shouldn't be read in any way or understood in any way as a lack of concern about the other issues, and I commend the staff for summarizing some of those issues in the report, and again, just thank folks for bringing those issues to our attention and to the attention of the public.
Given that, again, something else triggered in my mind, the reality is that we're going to write a report, and that report will not be limited to ballot initiatives. We, I think, have a responsibility to lay out issues that we could not finalize, decide upon, but that ought to be either addressed by the City Council or by another charter commission. We go out of existence on Election Day, but I know the City Council has already got a commission that is beginning to work, perhaps not on these issues, but we might give them some guidance. And the mayor can at any time appoint another commission, so that, given your point, Dale, I think it's important that the public understand that while we cannot address all of the issues that we think are important, there are subsequent means to do that. With that, I will entertain a motion.
Motion to adjourn?
Did I get a second from you, Carlo? Yes, sir. All right. Well, then, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, we are adjourned.
Yeah, I'll be there. Shoot, I'll be around.
All right, good.
Yeah.